Good afternoon, and thank you for sticking around for my presentation. We're gonna dive into the seagrasses now and hopefully not get stalked by any sneaky barracudas. I'll just let you know if you happen to see one. So yeah, we're gonna talk about seagrasses and their reproduction and the mystery of underwater pollination. To start, I would like to acknowledge Dr. Bridget Van Tussenbroek and her colleagues, as the vast majority of this work to date has been done by her and her team, mostly in Mexico. She and Ricardo Wong are partners on this project that we're about to embark on here in Trinidad and Tobago. So what are seagrasses? They are submerged, meaning they live under the water, marine flowering plants. They live in clear, shallow waters in coastal areas that are protected from wave action. Their global distribution is typically from the tropics to temperate zones. So why should we care about seagrasses? There's so many reasons, but I'll just talk about a few of the main ones. They provide nursery habitats for many fishery species. These include shrimp, snapper or redfish, grunts, groupers, lobsters, conch, all sorts of creatures. Their roots and rhizomes, which are the underground stems, help to stabilize the sediments in these coastal areas, and that then prevents erosion and protects the shoreline, as well as these roots and rhizomes produce and hold organic matter, providing a really important carbon sink. Also, the blades, the leaves of the seagrasses, help to slow currents. They filter the water of nutrients and pollutants and toxins. And in combination with the roots, they support a wide diversity of life. They're also a direct food source for things like green sea turtles, herbivorous fishes, including some reef fishes, sea urchins, like you can see in the picture here, snails, including queen conch, which we like to eat, and manatees in areas where manatees exist. But more importantly, they're an indirect food source via their detritus. So the detritus is the decomposing or decomposed leaf blades and the roots and other organic matter. And lots of different organisms like to eat that detritus. So if you take all this in combination, it provides extremely high rates of primary productivity. They are important habitat for nutrient cycling. These are also grasses, so they produce oxygen, which we need to breathe. So that's very important. And at the same time, they're incorporating carbon dioxide and using that to make food and taking that out of the environment. And as you know, with climate change, we have too much carbon dioxide in the environment. So these seagrasses are not only helping to sequester organic material carbon in their roots and rhizomes, but they're also directly taking the carbon dioxide out of the water. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How do seagrasses reproduce? Most seagrasses can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So we're going to start by talking about their asexual reproduction. So this occurs via these rhizomes. So you can see these rhizomes here in this drawing. These horizontal structures are the rhizomes. So these grow and spread throughout the sediments. And every so often, a new set of leaves pops up and a new set of roots. They can also asexually reproduce via fragmentation. So this occurs when a storm event happens. So a tropical storm or hurricane comes through and erodes away the sides of the seagrasses, like you see in this picture on the bottom left. And all those pieces of turtle grass, in this case, that become dislodged can then float in the water column and potentially settle out somewhere in a different spot and start growing a new seagrass bed. We also have fragmentation occurring when our large herbivores come and consume on these seagrasses. So here we can see a couple green sea turtles. It looks like they're eating coral, but really there's turtle grass in between the Porites corals here that they're feeding on. And basically when they feed on the seagrass, they can be messy. And then the last way that these fragments can occur is via our impacts, right? So if we go and anchor a boat in the seagrass or a propeller hits the seagrass, then that can pull up the seagrass and transport it into the water column, and it can spread that way. Okay, so in some cases, if there isn't much fragmentation or sexual reproduction going on, these seagrasses can form massive clonal metals that are all the same individual, which is crazy. In the Mediterranean Sea, they found a 15-kilometer area of Posidonia oceanica, Neptune grass, that's all one clone. And they've aged it to be tens of thousands of years old, if not hundreds of thousands of years old. That's how long this single clone has been around. It's insane. So these clonal systems, they work really well when the environment's very stable and consistent. But once you have disturbances like humans coming around, then there's a problem, because this one single genetic strain may not be resistant to whatever threat we place in its environment. So the fragments can travel quite far distances and create some genetic diversity, but that's kind of rare. Instead, we want these seagrasses to have the option for sexual reproduction. So the sexual reproduction occurs via their flowers. Most seagrasses are dioecious. So dioecious means that individual plants are either male or female. So they would either have male flowers or female flowers. A few species are monoecious. So this means the same individual can have both male and female flowers at the same time, while others are hermaphroditic. And this means a single flower can actually have both male and female parts inside of it. So we'll see some examples of all three of these flowering mechanisms as we go through our local species. So the male flowers produce pollen, just like you would find on land. And this pollen disperses by water movement. This is kind of hydrophily, right? So this hydrophilous pollen mostly moves with the water currents. So either with longshore drift, with the tides, or potentially with the waves and their swash. And most of the pollen in seagrasses has evolved to be more elliptical or long in shape, or several pollen grains kind of attach in these tubes, rather than being more spherical like you find of pollen on land. So the pollen on land is mostly traveling by wind. So those little spherical pollen grains are nice and light, and they travel quite easily in the air. Also, often pollen is contained in a mucilage, which is this kind of sticky substance that actually has high caloric value. What we're finding is that these crustaceans and polychaetes are actually coming to these male flowers, at least in the turtle grass, to eat this mucilage, which also has pollen in it. And this pollen sticks to them too, making them perfect little transporters of pollen from flower to flower. Right. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about each of these 6 species we have in Trinidad and Tobago, and kind of go through a little bit about their different reproductive parts and what they look like and when they flower. So the first species we have here is turtle grass, or Thalassia testudinum. The next one is shoal grass, Haliduli wrightii, followed by paddlegrass, Halophila discipiens, clover grass, Halophila bailinus, which was recently found in Shakashikari. Came across it on a dive there in 2020. Prior to that, there was no confirmed records of the species being in Trinidad and Tobago. It's not an invasive, it's native to the Caribbean. It's just kind of a rare species. So we're lucky to have this additional one around now. We have manatee grass, Serengodium filiforme, that's only found in Tobago, and widgeon grass, Rupia maritima, which is found in protected waters and often more brackish waters. So we find this species in the Caribbean swamp, for example. So I'm going to start off by talking about turtle grass and manatee grass, because these are more what we call the climax species. So they're found in more stable environments where the conditions are often much healthier. And then I'll go into the other species. To start, we have turtle grass here. It has a fairly wide, flat blade. In the pictures, you'll see from here on out of the flowers and seeds and other reproductive structures. Just to mention that they're not to scale, they're blown up to make them a little easier to see in this presentation. But most of these reproductive parts are fairly small and inconspicuous. Yeah. So here, where the M is, we see the male turtle grass flower, and below it we have the female turtle grass flower. And you tend to see these kind of differences across species, where the male flower is much thicker, and the female flowers seems to be much more wispy and thin, and have these thin petals. Here we can see once the female flower is pollinated, see the immature fruit, as well as a mature fruit next to it, and the seed here. And then once the seeds fall off, this is what the open fruit without the seeds. And here you can see this same fruit in color, as well as the open fruit that still has 2 seeds inside of it. The turtle grass is known to flower between April and September in Mexico. And the male flowers open at night, whereas the female flowers open during the day, and they're fairly short-lived, between, say, 12 to 24 hours. Right. Next grass is manatee grass. This grass can grow quite tall, but it is very narrow, and it has cylindrical blades, which is very unique. You won't find that in any of the other species that we have locally. It flowers a little differently. Oh, I should have mentioned for the turtle grass that the flowers tend to be near the base of the leaves, right? Whereas for the manatee grass, the flowers are near the top, similar to what you would see in most terrestrial plants, right? So here we have what's called a male cyme. So cyme is basically an inflorescence, a group of or cluster of several flowers, right? So these are the male ones. Here you can see the pollen release from the male cyme and an open male flower. And this is the female flower, again, with these filamentous petals or pistils, depending on the species. The pollen coming from the male flowers tends to be very filamentous as well and cotton-like. And once the female is pollinated, then these fruits start to form, and eventually they drop off from the cyme and often just colonize the seafloor just below the parent plants. The manatee grass flowers from March to July in Mexico, and they're known to flower during the day. So this species, similar to the turtle grass, is dioecious, so it has separate male and female cymes. Right. Our next species is the shoalgrass, which is an early successional species that's more tolerant to poor conditions. It is very thin-bladed, has fairly weak rhizomes. It's flat-bladed like the turtlegrass, but much, much narrower. So it's not cylindrical like the manatee grass. So that's how you can kind of tell these three apart. It tends to grow closer to shore or more disturbed areas. This species flowers between March and August in Mexico. The flowers are very, very simple and solitary, and they again grow at the base of the leaves, and they're dioecious. So this is a male flower, and here you can see it's very filamentous pollen being released. Here's an open male flower. The female flower, even more discreet, with just a pair of round ovaries at the base of each shoot, each with a long stigma. Once the female flower is pollinated, then you would get a young fruit starting to grow, and eventually that would lead to two small seeds with very hard coats. They tend to make a lot of these seeds in some areas and form an extensive seed bank in the sediments. Here we have paddlegrass. This again is a fairly early successional species and fairly tolerant to poor conditions. It's called paddlegrass because it has two blades coming out together, and they're shaped like little paddles. The leaves are tiny. They only grow to about 2 centimeters, maybe 2.5 centimeters in height off the seafloor. So you have to really look out for this species. Hence the flowers are going to be even smaller. And they look like this. These are the flower buds. This particular species is monoecious. So the male and female flowers occur together at the base of the leaves. Here is the male flower releasing its pollen, and the female flower here, as well as the open male flower once it's completing its pollen release. Once the female flower is fertilized, then a young fruit would start to form, and then it progresses into a more mature fruit. And here you can see the fruit with lots of seeds inside. So these can produce quite a lot of seeds for dispersal. Here's just a picture showing how small this little seed pack is on these tiny little leaves. Okay, our next species is in the same genus as our last one, Halophila discipiens, and this is clovergrass or Halophila balanus. It's called clovergrass because it has 4 leaves coming out of a single base and looks like a 4-leaf clover. Again, it's dioecious, and the flower bud comes out right in the middle of all of the 4 leaves. And here we can see a male flower releasing its pollen. Here's a mature male flower bud. Here we can see the 3 anthers of the male. The female flower is again very filamentous and discreet, hard to see. And once it's fertilized, a small young fruit will start to grow in the middle of the leaves. This species is known to flower and fruit between April and May in Belize. Right, and our last species that's found here in Trinidad and Tobago is the widgeon grass, Rupia maritima. It has kind of interesting flowers. These are hermaphroditic, which is kind of cool. So the flower has both male and female parts. It flowers between April and October in Mexico. So here we see some of the inflorescence. So again, this is both the male and female flowers contained in this. This is an immature one. This is a mature one. In this picture, it's opening the anthers, which are the male reproductive parts. So essentially, this efflorescence has 2 flowers. Surrounding the outside are the 4 anthers, and in the middle are the female reproductive parts. And here you can see them all open. So the anthers, all 4 anthers around each female pistil are open. The main parts are the female pistils. And once they are pollinated, then these fruits start to form. The witching grass looks very similar to shoal grass, except that the grass branches throughout and grows more horizontally and gets quite a bit taller in a lot of cases. The last species I'm going to talk about is an invasive seagrass species that's found throughout the Caribbean, except it somehow hasn't made its way to Trinidad and Tobago yet. I'm still kind of baffled by how it's not here. It was first recorded in 2008 in Grenada and has since spread to almost all the other Caribbean islands as well as Venezuela. It's native to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and then it invaded the Mediterranean Sea and eventually made its way over here to the Caribbean. It's called Halophila stipulaceae. I don't know of a common name for it as yet. It grows to about 5 centimeters long, but it's taller than our other Halophila species. It also has these veins, a lot more veins in it that are much more visible than the other Halophila species. And the turtle grass can look somewhat similar to this, but it won't have this veining, these cross veins. If you happen to see it, please let me know, because we're trying to track its eventual introduction, so that maybe we can try to contain it. This species is also dioecious, and its fruits can float in the water column for quite some time. But as of yet, they haven't recorded any fruits or flowers in the Caribbean. So as far as we know, all the growth throughout the Caribbean is via asexual reproduction. And it's likely being transported via vessels. So let's get to the fun part, the pollinators. What have Ben Tussenbrook and colleagues found so far? They found mostly crustaceans. So crustaceans are a sister group to the insects, both in phylum Arthropoda. And the insects are what we know pollinate the land plants, probably what you've heard about so far today. They also found that polychaete worms were acting as pollinators as well. So these are similar to the earthworms that you would find in the ground, except that they have these parapodia sticking out, which makes it a lot easier for the pollen to stick to. So the crustaceans that were seen visiting flowers of turtle grass, that's mostly what's been investigated so far. They included isopods, copepods, ostracods, mysid shrimp, tanaids, cumasians, and zoea, which are larval crabs. And they saw 3 different species of polychaetes from 3 different families. So quite a diversity of fauna that seems to be acting as pollinators in this underwater world. So the pictures on the bottom here, these are 3 different species, even 3 different genera of zoea. And in the circles, you can see the pollen granules that are stuck to them. Same for the polychaete worm here. There's a pollen grain here and likely one on the underside here as well. The turtle grass, as I mentioned earlier, the male flowers open at night, which is also when all these crustaceans and polychaete worms emerge from the sediments to feed. So they stay buried during the day to avoid being eaten. Once it gets dark, they all come out and start rummaging around for food. What makes a better food than some sticky mucilage filled with pollen, right? The flowers of the turtle grass are near the base of the leaves, so they don't have to go far from the substrate where they just came out from their day sleep and go to the flower, stock up on some mucilage and get all stuck with pollen and then move to the next flower. So when they move to the female flowers, some of those pollen gets stuck back to the female flowers and then can fertilize her. These are the species and groups of animals that we know of so far that are acting as pollinators for the turtle grass, but it's likely there's many other types of pollinators for these different seagrasses, and we really need to investigate kind of each species and what's happening at different times of the day when they are flowering. And we may find that even some larger species and additional phyla may be contributing to this pollination activity. And that's what we're hoping to do with our project here in Trinidad and Tobago. So now I want to show you a little video, again, done by Van Tissenbroek and colleagues, showing some of these critters in action. So this is showing a crustacean amphipod on a male flower with some pollen attached to it. And here we have another male flower with the polychaetes. And you can see some pollen attached to the polychaete near its head there. And then these same types of animals arrive at the female flowers, although not quite as frequently because there's not all the mucilage to eat. But here we can see the amphipod in the female flower. We can also see zoea larvae visiting the female flowers. I'll show the picture earlier as well. And the polychaetes too at female flowers. So that's kind of reproduction in a nutshell, what we know so far. But unfortunately, we're seeing major declines in seagrasses globally. So between 1879 and 2006, Waycott et al. Found a 29% decline in global seagrasses, which is quite large. And Orth et al. Saw that reported cases of seagrass loss have increased almost tenfold over the last 40 years in both tropical and temperate regions. We're seeing similar, if not worse, trends in Trinidad and Tobago. Here's a map by Juman and Alexander in 2006. It's kind of an old map of where seagrasses used to be found in Trinidad and Tobago. So in Trinidad, we can see most of these seagrasses were found in the Northwest Peninsula and down the islands. Historically, there are also seagrasses at Pointed Pier, Claxton Bay, Salibia, Guayguayare Bay, to some extent off the Blue River and the foreshore. Around Tobago, most of the seagrasses were around southwestern Tobago, with a few in Kings Bay and Speyside. But unfortunately, if we look at some monitoring data from IMA between 2002 and 2015, for turtlegrass at least, we've seen huge declines in the productivity, and especially for the seagrass beds around Northwest Trinidad and the ones around Tobago that aren't in the Buku Reef Marine Park. So the ones in the Buku Reef Marine Park in Bonacord Lagoon or in Buku Bay are either staying very stable or in some cases increasing. Everywhere else, we're seeing pretty drastic declines, especially in turtlegrass, which is our sign of a healthy seagrass bed. So some of the threats, the reasons why these seagrasses are declining, I would say here the biggest one is probably construction activities. So any work that's done along shore, from mangrove removal to dredging and filling, essentially leads to erosion of the shoreline and excess sedimentation. And when that sediment runs off into the coastal waters, it buries the seagrasses. So it buries them, and it also clouds the water, which keeps light from getting to them, so they can't grow either. They're super stressed. We also are seeing high levels of agricultural runoff from coastal farms. So these will be releasing high numbers of nutrients and pesticides, which likely are really bad for these pollinators because crustaceans are in the same phylum as insects. So if there's a pesticide to kill insects, it's probably going to kill these crustaceans as well. We also have issues of sewage, gray water, and other pollutants and litter entering our coastal water bodies and adding more nutrients and toxins. Essentially, all these nutrients lead to a process called eutrophication. So when you have lots of nutrients, it leads to a bloom of phytoplankton that tends to block out the lights underneath, so the seagrasses can't get enough light. As the plankton bloom dies off, because the bloom doesn't last forever, then a lot of bacteria come in and eat the decaying phytoplankton, and those bacteria consume a ton of oxygen and often lead to dead zones. Climate change, we're seeing increased temperatures and sea level rise, and this is basically kind of squeezing them into a smaller area, right? With sea level rise, water gets deeper. That means less light, but they can't move to shallower water because we have seawalls, we have roads, we have buildings along the shoreline. So there's really nowhere for them to move inland. We're also seeing, removal and trampling by bathers and tour boat operators in Tobago. So this is kind of disheartening, and we really need more education so that people swimming in these areas know how important these seagrasses are and how interesting they are. If you snorkel around these seagrasses, you're going to see all kinds of cool stuff. You can see seahorses and sea urchins and sea cucumbers and sea stars and a bunch of cool fish. They're awesome. So in conclusion, our knowledge of seagrass flowering is quite limited geographically. Basically, we know about a few species in Mexico and in Belize, but really we're just kind of on the cusp of this research. Up until very recently, pollination was thought to be solely by water movements or hydrophily, but now these recent studies on turtle grass have shown they're in fact underwater pollinators. So more research is needed on other seagrass species and in other locations to better understand this underwater process. And this is currently underway right here, where we've just started this project on seagrasses in Trinidad and Tobago to look at their reproductive times, both times of year and times of day, as well as what pollinators that we have here. So we should know more about this soon, so stay tuned. And also just to highlight the seagrass community and its biodiversity is likely to be very critical to future seagrass resilience as it increases their genetic diversity, allowing them to reproduce more effectively via sexual reproduction. So if we keep all the pollinators and other diversity intact, then there's more likely to be high genetic diversity in the seagrasses themselves. Here are my references. And I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to contact me, my email address is there again, and my website. If you do happen to notice seagrass flowers anywhere, please let us know so we can track that for this project. And also, please be on the lookout for this invasive seagrass. Thank you.